All right, welcome to this talk about artificial intelligence and the essay, I guess maybe student writing in general, the future of that. Charles has been kind enough to let us use his video as a keynote for this. And the keynote, if you will, is this question of whether the essay can maintain its integrity in an environment where GPT-3 is able to produce passable, is that want to say passable prose that and I guess this is an issue that we can discuss how good it will be at that. Will it be GPT-3 or GPT-4 that will be able to do this is of course also an issue. And so we're trying to think about what the consequences are for higher education that artificial intelligence has developed this capacity. I'll let you introduce yourselves just very briefly, but I think what we'll do is put some bios in the description, as they say, so that you can link to any details you want. But if you want to say something very briefly, you can. The speaking order, which has been decided in advance, is I will say some things first, my reflections. Then we will have Anna will say some things. We will then have Mark, who will bring his views. Then Annette will add her voice, and then we'll have Charles sort of close things off again, or close things off to round things out. But then what we'll do is ask each other questions and see where the discussion leads. That's the plan. Great. With that, I will switch to speaker view. Here we go. All right. So my thoughts on this are, I come at it from the point of view of a resident writing consultant, we call it here at the Copenhagen Business School, which means I work a lot with students, but I also work a lot with researchers about their writing. And what has sort of happened through the years is those two functions have played off each other. So whenever I help teachers with their students and how to help them to write, they say, oh, I should maybe use some of these tricks as well in my own writing. But whenever I help researchers with their writing, they say, hey, wait a minute, my students should hear this. And the basic thing that I show them, and I thought I would actually just share this with you, is something I call writing. It's something I've made up based on based on something called business process reengineering, which was a kind of lean management in the 1990s. So I came up with this idea of writing process reengineering, and the basis of that, the main focus of that, and this is where I feel kind of like I've been training a monster in some sense, is just the basic writing task of writing a paragraph, right? So I define a paragraph in these really, really functional terms, these really practical terms. It's at least 6 sentences, at most 200 words. It says one thing and supports, elaborates, or defends it. You can sit down and write one in 27 minutes if you decide the day before what you want to say. So it's pretty practical, pretty hands-on approach to the paragraph, very functional kind of idea. But of course, that also means that I've defined the paragraph as something that it turns out a machine can do. And that's what we're talking about today, is that if academic writing really just is writing these orderly, coherent paragraphs, then maybe people don't need to do it. Maybe machines can do it. So the question that I take away from Charles's video is, can the take-home essay be saved? And I emphasize this idea of the take-home essay because I think that there's an obvious way in which, if we take students and we say, you have to train yourself to be able to write anything you know into a coherent prose paragraph in 27 minutes, That's a skill that we can test using on-site examination. We don't have to abandon prose as a medium for examination. We can just say, let's ask the students, make the students, require the students to demonstrate that they can actually compose a coherent prose paragraph in a it doesn't even have to be closed book, but it has to be offline, an offline environment. And so the shift from the take-home essay, which I think is true, that that's going to be a hard one to save entirely, could either go to oral exams. And one of the students in my class that we were teaching on Friday said, well, this is great because I've always thought oral examination, conversation is a much better test of our intellectual competence than writing. And so I tried to defend writing as actually a slow conversation. And if you take it really seriously, then writing is actually a better test of your competence as long as you see it as an interaction between students, writing for each other, using it as a basis for conversation, and so forth. So so I don't think the shift to oral exams would be ideal, like that we just go to oral exams, and of course not to anything like multiple choice or just purely uh, non-prose based, non-writing based exams. So we have this possibility of having in-class essays of some kind or proctored and vigilated exams. And I think that is where I would like to go with this. I'd really say we can use the class time to encourage students to train their ability to express themselves in prose, and they will have to perform that, so to speak, live. And we've actually got a course running next semester where we're going to try this. So there's going to be assignments along the way, but they're to be understood as training exercises for the real test, which is a 3-hour in-class written essay, right? And so they have to be ready to compose. And so if they're writing their essays using a machine, that's not going to help them for that test, right? But then I realized, and I think this is where I'll kind of end it, I realized maybe we could have people do take-home essays combined with hearing them in an oral setting, sort of getting them to talk about what they've written, and in fact, getting them to rewrite some of the paragraphs that they claim to have written in a proctored situation, just as kind of a test, so that you're basically, by handing something in, you're claiming you could have written, you're claiming you did write it, right? So then you are claiming you could rewrite it under a pressured situation, then sort of random testing of the ability to write these things they claim to have been able to write. That might be another way of saving the take-home, because the take-home experience is an important one, not one that we just want to lose. So yeah, to conclude, I think this is definitely going to be a disruption of education, but I think given the way students these days do their take-home assignments, sometimes in kind of a weird haze of stress and late night sessions and a mess of notes and the way they work. I mean, it's not perfect the way they work. This new testing regime might be actually a way of getting them to think very seriously about how to train the discipline of prose to compose these paragraphs. That's kind of what I'm hoping for going forward. I think I kept the time roughly correctly there. Anna, do you have some comments?
Yes. Hi. So I'm Anna Mills. I teach English or writing at College of Marin in California. And I've written a textbook, How Arguments Work, that I think it takes as a premise this idea that writing as a slow process is a process designed to facilitate and encourage critical thinking and to extend it, and that so that we're asking our students to do this because it's a process that has value in its own right and helps them become better critical thinkers. So, that sets me up for a certain orientation to the AI writing that makes me dismiss the idea that, oh, maybe since computers can do this, we don't need to. It's like, no, we still need to, because this is the core of a college education, is sort of learning to think more deeply and slowly and communicate that organically. So that's what I take as a premise in approaching this. And I really appreciated Charles's talk and Thomas's comments. I would definitely agree with the concern about, is this breaking the take-home essay? And I think I started my experiments with the idea that that there might be ways to change our prompts so that we could be pretty sure that students would not be able to auto-generate reasonable completions, that there might be types of prompts that GPT-3 was not good at. And as I've experimented more, and we've seen that the new version of GPT-3 that just came out, and we've heard the rumors about GPT-4, the combination of that has convinced me now that that's not going to be possible. That essays that are good enough, as Charles says, to pass will be generatable, and that, if we won't be able to prevent students from auto-generating, say, 50% up to 100% of a writing assignment. So that also has led me to ask, what else can we do to save the out-of-class essay? And I'm still holding out some hope that there might be a way to create transparency, that we might be able to either regulate or get big companies to voluntarily offer a tool for checking any particular text against their database of outputs. So they could say, well, these particular phrases and sentences have been generated at some point by GPT-3, and that could be incorporated into, say, a Turnitin tool. I would love to see that, or perhaps some kind of watermarking. That doesn't seem likely, but maybe, so that text could be detectable as having been auto-generated. Because then we could use this technology, we could regulate how much we allow students to use it and monitor how much they're using it in different kinds of assignments. And we could proceed with designing our pedagogy around the learning outcomes rather than defending against what students might or might not do with the AI. Failing that, I think certainly that there might be some benefits into this, combining the flipped classroom approach of having students do the work in class and do other kinds of learning out of class. We're going to have to look at surveillance, different forms of surveillance. There's a lot of problems with that for students with disabilities and anxiety. Students who are marginalized probably would be disproportionately impacted by those kinds of practices. And that's a big concern for me. I know many of my students would be terrified and probably either drop out or fail if they were put under that time pressure, or having to handwrite things. And so that's a concern. And then another point I just wanted to make is that I do think we will have to teach about and with these tools that they will become part of digital literacy, because these are the underpinnings for many tools that are part of the writing environment now, from grammar checkers to autocomplete to paraphrasing software and assistive technologies. And they have some of the same problems with bias and error that text generation has. So I think we need to think about it also on that spectrum, and that we need to be educating students about the underlying technology and its problems and uses. And text generation is just a part of that. Finally, I do have hope that as humanities folks, we have some role and we can sort of assert ourselves as having something to say about how this probably should roll out and how it can be done in a way that minimizes harms to society and maximizes benefits. And that is what we're interested in. And so let's not just let the tech companies tell us what to respond to, but perhaps we should keep remembering that we may have a bigger role in this and more to offer to the process of how this unfolds in the coming years. And I think I better stop there. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Mark, have you got some comments?
Oh boy, some comments. I don't even know where to begin. Like many of you, I just kind of became aware of this sort of recently. I think it was like May or even June where it really became on people's radar. And just tracking this and sort of following along with it has been it's been a trip. It's been a trip to say the least. But we have been using it here at the University of Mississippi. It's where I teach as a lecturer within our classes so far, in a very limited, very structured way too. I'm involved with a group within my department in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric, and we have about, for my classes, about 30,000 words of student reflections who have been using these tools, talking about in what way they're using them too. I focused on using them in an assistance manner, not as a generative manner, assisting them in brainstorming and critical thinking, and also working on developing counter arguments. We've worked with some people over on the continent, as they say, with you all too, in Barcelona, a company called Format, to build some different tools, including a counter argument tool and a general writing assistant tool to kind of help facilitate this with students. So I'm really interested in seeing how we can sort of use this technology to help address issues with writing, issues with equity, and other sort of issues we've seen historically that have been there too. Like you guys, I am partly excited and also partly terrified what this means to student learning, student writing process, and all of that goes into that mix as well too. On top of all these things, I think the thing that does kind of give me pause is that I think Thomas's approach of going into an oral exam is an interesting way of looking at this. What worries me is that the cheapest way that we have right now available to us is using AI proctoring services. Our university right now, the University of Mississippi, we have the Respondus browser as of now. It is incredibly inexpensive. It's like $6,000 for a year. So that's for all students. That's essentially the price we pay for an adjunct, right? For one section of courses or two sections of courses. So I think that's what's going to be where a lot of people who are not wanting to experiment with this, who feel a little bit fearful, are going to be headed. And the type of AI that's within the AI proctoring services is, filled with bias, just like the actual text generators too. We've seen multiple lawsuits, and we've also seen a fairly significant pattern of students of color, especially female students of color, being flagged incorrectly within the system and being accused of cheating because of it. So I think what I would like to focus on, and what we're trying to do here at the university, is talk about AI literacy, going not only to our students, talking about what this technology is, but talking to our faculty, talking to our staff. I've lost track of how many meetings I've had this semester, and I'm not usually one who goes out and actually does lots of meetings. But we are having those conversations, and I hope you all are also including your faculty and colleagues in other departments in those conversations as well too. There is that initial shock that we get from our actual faculty too, but when we talk about how these tools might be used in a way that could help students, it is a much more, I hate to use the word generative in our discussion, but a much more, I guess, generous sort of discussion about what these tools might actually mean. So a little bit excited, a little bit terrified, but that's okay. It's a new thing. And I am excited to hear what you guys are all doing as well within your universities. And I think that what Thomas is proposing is an innovative and unique way of trying to combat this. I just, from my perspective, if we did this throughout the university without 30,000 students, we don't have the physical space to do this right now. And the funny thing is, you mentioned this about blue books and like going into a physical handwriting proctoring. We talked about handwriting. I literally walked past a student this morning who was upset because the library bookstore ran out of blue books because we've no longer been ordering them anymore, right? We've gone up to these online solutions. It's like we haven't really even thought about like these types of things. So some interesting ideas. I'm happy to share some student experiences as we go through this. And I guess I'll end it there.
I have to remember to turn on my microphone every once in a while. Thank you, Mark. Annette, have you got some remarks?
Sure. So first, thank you so much, Thomas, for getting us together. This is a great conversation. I'm really glad to be part of it. I feel like I'm already learning a lot. I'm taking a lot of notes. So thank you. So I'm Annette V. I am both a researcher and a writing program administrator. I direct the composition program at University of Pittsburgh. I teach graduate and undergraduate classes there. And when I think about this, I mean, as a researcher, I research writing and technology, and I often like to take a historical perspective in my work. So my past work is on how computer programming is following the same patterns as textual literacy. And my current project is on tracing different approaches to automating writing, from automata to typewriters, seances, and computer-generated essays. But as a writing program administrator, I think all of the questions that you're bringing up are really salient and things that haven't hit us yet. But I wonder how much of it is because you know, I'm not paying close enough attention to actually what students are doing, or that we can't actually access the kinds of things that students are doing. So I'm actually very, very curious about the student take on this. I have only some windows in. But when I think about what we can understand from the history aspect of this, I'm thinking about different kinds of resistances to writing technologies that we've seen historically, like erasers and spell checkers and things like that. And Dennis Barron's work is really particularly useful here. Just thinking about, like, there's always been these kind of moral panics about, no, students aren't going to know how to write, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question is this different, or maybe more productively, how is this different? Because of course it is different, but to what degree, to what kind? Should we be morally panicking? You know, to some degree, yes, no. Mark, what you said about being terrified and excited, I think really resonates with me. But asking these questions is really important. And so I'm really glad that we're here asking those questions and thinking about them together. I don't think that there's good answers. I'm, as a teacher and a writing program administrator, I see some of the differences being there's different thought processes required for working with AI or working with other AI writing tools, which is the term that I've heard Anna use to kind of broadly describe a lot of different, you know, say Grammarly, as well as GPT-3, which I think are different in degree, but maybe not in kind. I think too, there's different ways to understand how to teach with these things. And I think acknowledging it, of course, is the first step, which is what we're here doing. So I appreciate that part. And then I'm also interested in the human aspect here. How the generation of writing has stood in for artificial general intelligence. So, and this is like thinking about the work that I've done with 18th century automata. The idea of making automata who could write was a kind of like, we can recreate humans. So it's an early kind of artificial intelligence. And so writing has stood in for AGI. And when and then I started thinking too, as a prompt for this question, to think historically back to Montaigne and the essay, right, which is a process, a trying. And so Anna, your point about the process aspects of it and not the product, I think is really resonant with that idea. I think you know, the essay was also a way of, it was proving thought. So the essay itself is a kind of writing that proves intelligence, and also a way of proving humanity, that, you know, somebody could use an essay to prove, like, I am a human, I think in this way. So, and I think as writing teachers, we're always thinking about how to work with students, the process, and not just the product. I think about all of, the best things we know about teaching writing, about writing center pedagogy, is all about working with students and improving their thought processes. It's not about what's the best essay you can produce, right? But that's a hard thing to communicate to students, right? Because what we assess is the essay they produce. So I think that your ideas, Thomas, about the oral exam, or how students are responding to that, thinking about what's the best test of the processes involved inside the head, or how we measure the differences and what they're learning. So yeah, when I think back to the idea of essay, and I think back to large language models, and in particular all the citations from Bender that have been mentioned before, and Charles, you mentioned that in your keynote. The essay is a form of trying. It is not of knowledge. So it's the process, not the knowledge, not the kind of more static thing. And the stored information is what the large language models have, but they're not trying anything. They're not exercising natural judgment, which was Montaigne's concept, because they don't have judgment, even though we use them, of course, for judgment and algorithmic judgment, and all of those kinds of processes, which is a whole different issue. So I'm thinking what Anna just said. Should we be thinking about writing as a kind of exercise, that it's a habit of mind? That is this something that we need to be impressing upon students even more than we already do, to kind of dissuade from the use of AI? I get nervous about the kind of idea of presenting students as always already cheating, or attempting to circumvent the processes that we have. And so, Charles, in your keynote, when you talk about the massification and the labor issues of education, I think that's really resonant. I don't know how we fight against that necessarily as humanities people or as writing teachers. I think that's a really difficult problem, right? So what we should do is have everybody have a writing tutor, where they work on writing. That's the easy solution, right? Is pay everybody more and have more faculty. But I think, trying to consider, what are the ways that we are presenting our students as, violators of these academic integrity problems, or how we think of the, Marc, you said generative work, which I think is wonderfully doubly resonant here, and how we can think of doing it in generatively is really helpful for me to think through this. So I have a few questions too that I can talk about for the next step, but those are kind of my opening salvos here. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Annette. So Charles, you have the sort of the last word, and take your time, because you also get to kind of react to what we've said, spurred by your keynote.
Sure. So I'm Charles Knight. I work as a senior consultant for Advanced HE, which is an organization that started in the UK but is global. We have 300 university members, and we work with institutions around learning and teaching. The disclaimer I have to give at this point: I'm speaking in a personal capacity, so none of my statements should be taken as policy statements on behalf of my organization. So many things to unpick here. So I was furiously making notes while you were all talking. So the first one is, I just want to pick up on this issue of speed. So we've all kind of commented on this, and I think what is happening across the sector, across the world, people haven't quite realized yet that this is already becoming quite pervasive. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, it's becoming pervasive across the piece. And the point that was just made about students and thinking about students not in a negative way as people who want to cheat. I think one of the challenges we're going to face is, many of you commented about the fact that you've got all sorts of grammar tools. One of the challenges we're going to face is that if you look at the direction of travel for Microsoft and other organizations, they're going to bake more and more of these tools into their core products. I already write many emails by just hitting the tab button because it predicts what I want to say next. So I think within 4 or 5 years, we will end up in a situation, quite legitimately, if you said to a student who spent a few weeks on an essay, which bits of this are yours and which was suggested, they probably couldn't remember, right? So there's no intent. And I think that's going to be really challenging. I think the thing that I worry about is you have all taken a really pedagogical approach, which is also encapsulated in a kind of understanding of the field and where the fields come from. Where I'm really nervous is because this is moving at such pace, I could totally see the moral panic that was mentioned happening, say, early 2023, where regulators and governments say, oh, we can't trust what students are submitting because of AI. And I did another video where I talked about we potentially will see a hard turn to kind of students sitting in halls writing exams because governments and regulators will say this is integrity. And I'm nervous about that because that's not a pedagogically sound approach. It's not informed by pedagogy. It's integrity theatre, right? And we would get into all of the kind of proctoring issues that were mentioned. And so I think we have to think really carefully about something that the inventor of the search engine, Wolfram Alpha, the Comrade Wolfram, who invented it. I met him at an event and we were talking, and he said something to me that blew my mind. And I thought about it, just blew my mind. He said, we have to reinvent education to acknowledge that computers exist, right? And I thought about it. I thought so much of what we do is based on an idea that these things don't exist. And I think the kind of approaches that we're all talking about is we all acknowledge that this exists. And I think we're all coming from a fairly positive, optimistic point of view, which is not to have a moral panic and not to retreat into this will ruin society, but to think really carefully about where does the human creativity and where does the human skill set and the core writing skills and the mindsets and frameworks that we want students to develop, how do they fit in a world where students can get AI to do other aspects of this, right? And I think there is opportunity to think about how we use that to develop student skills. And just going back to what Thomas was saying at the start about getting students to do oral presentations and think about getting students to do things in person, that's really interesting because we can already see AI creeping into those areas. Microsoft, in the latest version of PowerPoint, has an AI speech coach tool that will analyze your presentation as you give it and give you feedback on your tone, your language usage, and so on and so on, which I suspect is full of bias, by the way. But I think we're gonna see all of those things happen. And I think the other thing is that we need to think about is I was thinking about this in my own practice because I've been looking at AI for a while. I often now, when I start with a document that I need to write, I really struggle with the blank page. So often now I use the AI tools that we're talking about to generate some content. At the end of it, I've generally overwritten all of the content, right? But I no longer have this blank page problem. So I think there are all sorts of really interesting things for us to consider about how we accept that AI exists, but we need to think about within our kind of massive systems of higher education about what that really means to what we can do and can't do going forward. Because a few people got in touch with me about the video we called Keynote and said, well, you know, it's not very pedagogically focused, but it was never intended to be. It was intended as a conversation about if we've got this massive change in the systems we have, these are potential outcomes, right? But they're economic and political outcomes. And if we're not careful, that will drive our pedagogical practices. And so I think the conversation we're having is really important because it is about what's the pedagogical and student-focused response to that. And I think there is still a window of opportunity for people like us and colleagues around the world to drive the conversation from a pedagogical framework and a student-focused framework. Because what I'm really nervous about and what I was trying to get to in that video was if we're not careful, we'll end up with a process and regulatory driven response, which is get everyone into halls or let's do online digital proctoring, which has all sorts of ethical problems and ethical issues. I guess the other big challenge that I do not have an answer to, though, is many of the things that we discuss and say, these are different approaches we can take. It's about how do we scale those in the systems that we have. And I love the idea that we all get a writing coach. I think that would be absolutely fantastic. I was only commenting the other day in my organization. I work with a colleague who's a much better writer than I am, right? So I come up with the ideas and she spins it into amazing prose. And so we have to think about those human connections and how we bring people together. And a final point I make, because I'm really interested for us to have a conversation about this, is the other aspect as a minor point I think we need to consider as well. We're all aware of contract cheating. What we also have to be really aware of is if you look at any industrial process, economic process, and contract cheating is an economic process as much as it is a social political one, they always automate, right? So if we don't change, contract cheaters, organizations will already be incorporating this into what they do. They must be, because it speeds up their process and cuts their costs. And any organization, legitimate or not, is always looking to do that. So I think, to summarize, there is still an opportunity for educators, academics, teachers, and scholars to drive the conversation. But if we're not careful and we're not quick, I think we will head into a different direction that none of us would be keen on. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Charles. I think we've got lots of things on the table. I also have pieces of paper here with many things I want to talk about. The process now will be, we're going to go around and we're going to try to do this in a sort of cross-examination kind of way-ish, kind of maybe more of a panel discussion, like where we're like congressional testimony, but we're also the congressmen that are doing the so we can ask each other some questions at will. I guess we'll do it in the same order. I think if that's okay with you, we'll just go around. And I have two. I think just basically two questions. We'll see, and we'll try to make this sort of so it doesn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes per person. It's just clarifying questions to start things going. And the first one is to Anna and I think Marc, to Anna and Marc, and it picks up on this idea about what the positive pedagogical potential of integrating AI into our writing. So if we sort of take this assumption that the students will be using it, they will be curious, they will try it, and it's going to be as unavoidable as them using grammar checkers. And I'm curious, and I'll get back to this in a moment. I'm curious to what Annette meant when she said that this goes back to the eraser, that the moral panic over the eraser. I think that's quite interesting, right? So let's assume they are going to use this. Anna, you said something quite interesting. You said you initially thought that some sort of prompt design, prompt exercising could, like if you work out your exam prompt properly, then you could thwart the AI, and you've given up on that. So I'm really curious to hear some more about your experiences on that. Like, what made you give up? What did you think you could accomplish with it? And related to that is Marc's talk about how to get them to use it in a supportive way rather than a generative way, so that it doesn't do the content generation, but it does support somehow their work. So I'm really curious about those two things. So if Anna could say a little bit about this prompt design and the road to giving up on that, and then Marc can talk a little bit about the supporting versus generating thing. Anna?
Yeah, so I was influenced by Lauren Goodlad of the Critical AI Institute at Rutgers, and she suggested that she had used a technique of asking students to compare and contrast long texts and incorporate class discussion, and sort of requiring so much that you couldn't fit it into a prompt. And I've heard many other approaches on Twitter, including verifying sources, asking for certain kinds of sources. requiring process writing, so requiring many steps. People thought that AIs wouldn't be able to do that. And as I've experimented, I've been working on a kind of a collection of sample GPT-3 generated essays. I've seen that it can do compare and contrast, and you can reprompt it with an actual source. You can get it to elaborate, you can get it to quote, you can get it to do brainstorms, outlines, metacognitive reflections, not necessarily well, and but you can sort of work around those things and still get it to do much of the writing, if not all. And that's where I now think that you can't really count on having a prompt that it won't be able to do significantly. It's just through that experimentation of my own. And I know that in terms of incorporating it, I am excited to try that. I started out wanting to focus on that and not on defending against it. And I still am intrigued, but I also appreciated that Lauren Goodlad pushed back on that with me on Twitter, saying, you know, okay, that might stimulate critical thinking, but what are the opportunity costs of not assigning them to read human-generated writing? Anytime we assign them to engage with the computer and engage with the outputs, there is an opportunity cost where they're not engaging with what a human writer has come up with. So I've kind of put that on pause in my own teaching, but I know Annette is really exploring that very deeply. So I'm curious what she might say about that. I know that Marc has been doing that intensively, as he mentioned. So I'll stop here for my part.
Well, thank you, Anna. I think that's a really interesting process to think about too. I've also given up on that. I was at that point too, where I thought we could prompt AI and kind of do these really interesting things. And yeah, this last update too to DaVinci 003, I guess that's what they're calling it too. It's not even GPT-4, but many of you have been showing it on Twitter, is that it used to take us a lot of different steps to generate an essay, even a small 5-paragraph essay. And now it just on a single command will do a 5-paragraph essay. So I think we started doing this back in May or June or something like that. So within less than half a year, it's already at the level where it is too. So yeah, I have been moving toward this idea too, kind of echoing what Charles talked about too. I would call this pain points, addressing the student writing process. Like a student comes to a point where they're terrified of the blank page, or they're terrified of a specific type of rhetorical thinking we're asking them to do, like counter arguments, and they're struggling with that. We've been looking at very specific types of tools within Elicit and Format that actually do that and help students engage with that sort of thing. So Elicit has about, God, I can't even keep track of how many tools they have built for this too, but they have a stakeholders tool, they have a counter argument tool, they have a research question tool, where you can put in a topic and it generates a few dozen different responses where you can then click on and begin to see if this is actually relevant to your research. Ways for you guys to think about this. There are also elements that we use for Mott to use your own writing, your own organic essay, and to use that as the prompt to then generate counter arguments from that. And so some of the feedback we've gotten from our students so far is that this helped them basically tackle a large amount of information in a much quicker amount of time frame and ease some of the cognitive load, right? The sort of thinking process that they did too as well. The one main thing that I noticed is that students said, well, I knew this was there. It was always on the tip of my tongue, but oh, wow, it's right there now. It's here. I can actually see that easier. This may be, I always thought of at least one counter argument for my essay, but now here's 7 of them. And I didn't think it could be that much intense. So it has the potential to be a deepening of the research and writing process. Now, here's where I'm going to do this to myself and say, time out. How do we actually, I don't even know how to do this in language. How do we actually make sure that this stays in a supportive role and doesn't let generative text take control? You know, how do we make sure that the student has their voice secure in their essay too, and doesn't let that generative text sort of take over and then be becoming part of the bias within it too, and actually start driving that text forward? I don't know what the answers are to that. I'm happy we're having this discussion. I think what worries me is that, and what Charles has kind of talked about as well too, is that there is a very limited amount of time for us to actually be proactive in this and start thinking about this in our pedagogy. Academically, though, we don't move at the pace of technology. And that's become very, very apparent to me in my own university, just having discussions with people too. So it's possible that we will have some really good exercises to develop to help with our students, but it's going to be, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to stop the generative aspect of it, right? So we're working on it. We're thinking about some things. I will say students, from their reflections, most of them liked working with Elicit, which is a tool that is out right now. It's very linear. When they came to working with Format, which is spatial, there's little boxes everywhere too. They got a little freaked out by that because it's thinking spatially and not in this too. But overall, no one said that they hated this. No one said that it was damaging to their writing process or anything like that. Of course, we did do this in a very a limited manner in terms of what we were having them do. We didn't just open up the GPT playground and say, here, generate an essay. We didn't do that. I'll stop talking now because I tend to ramble. My apologies.
I think we're being very disciplined. Very good. Annette, I have a question to you, and then I'll hand it off to Anna for questions. But like I say, I thought it was really, really interesting what you said about that this goes back to the eraser. I'm not going to kind of hold you to it. I mean, if you want to tell the story about how erasers caused a moral panic, I think that might be useful. But what I'm really interested in is this has reminded me that when Grammarly came out, we were asked I was asked at the library, because my role is a writing coach, is this something that the library should purchase as a kind of an institutional license for, and there was some pressure from the researchers that that this should be made available as a tool for everybody. And I remember just completely, I panicked morally. I thought, no, of course not. People should learn how to do grammar themselves. There should not be this should not. And I don't want everybody's style to become homogenized by Grammarly's suggestion to simplify the language or whatever, especially in academic writing. I think people should do that for their own reasons. They shouldn't do it because there's a blue line under. So I very much, but now, of course, that's ridiculous because even Word's grammar checker is basically as good as Grammarly and this sort of thing, right? So there's, so it's just become a very normal background ambient kind of condition. And so I just wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit about why large language models may be different, or maybe that we should just stop panicking and that this will just fade into the background like everything else. Could you say a little more about that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So first of all, erasers. Again, I'm drawing on Dennis Barron's work, who I think is probably familiar to at least a few of the people here. But the idea of the challenge of erasers, of course, is like if you're handwriting something and you're able to erase something, then it erases the thought process, where you can imagine if there's like erasers versus crossing things out, that which would have been, of course, the other alternative, then by crossing things out, you could access a student's thought processes. What was the word that they thought about but then decided against? And so that kind of panic from teachers was, we can't access student thinking and student processes if they use this technology to literally erase their processes. And so I think that it's getting at some of the same questions that we're talking about here, is that, and Charles, your point about, I loved your point about the kind of suggestive writing and asking a student, say a week or two later, can you point to the things that the AI suggested versus the things that you actually used? And I started thinking about writing my own emails, and would I be able to name like when I've like tabbed over and accepted the suggestion versus when I've written it myself? Absolutely not. Like that information is gone, right? And so that process it's no longer accessible. But of course, the whole idea of accessing anybody's thought process is a fallacy in the first place. And I think that that brings me back to this kind of concept. I mean, first of all, that's like a very central question to the idea of education in the first place. But second of all, it's central to the history of AI and thinking about Turing's article, Alan Turing's article from 1950 from Mind, which about can machines think? And that's asking about, he's got this like beautiful line in there about the fact that it's a polite convention that we consider each other as thinking. I can't access any of the things that are happening in your minds, even though I presume that you're humans and having thought processes going on, right? This is just an assumption. And so I think that kind of that like black boxing of the human brain and the kind of attempts to use technologies of processes of education to access the human brain, and then, to erase it and to generate or simulate processes of the human brain. There's all of those things are at work in these questions for me. Now, as a researcher, what I want to do is just like ask interesting questions and like philosophical questions about, are we human, and are we ever really human, and what's the purpose of education, and like all these things, right? But then when I put on my WPA hat, it's like, should we have a policy about AI collaboration? And those things are related. And I think that I can use both parts of my positionality here to kind of inform the other one, but I think they're very different questions. And I think, Charles, your keynote, I think, was kind of pointing to some of those things too, when you're saying, here's what educators are asking and here's what we should really be asking.
Thank you, Annette. And it's very kind of you, very polite to assume that we're thinking. That's very good. Thank you. With that, I'll pass the baton to Anna if you have any questions of any of us. We may have run into our first technical glitch. Anna, are you there?
She may have frozen. She may rejoin in a second, I suspect.
Yeah. Anna, okay, maybe I'll just say a quick thing here while we're waiting. This whole idea of are we human and that whole problem. One of the things when you mentioned Montaigne and this whole idea that essay writing is kind of a test of being human, right? It just reminded me of Kierkegaard's use of, I think he gets it from Talleyrand and he gets it from Voltaire maybe, where it's kind of a joke that he makes where he says, we have language to hide our thoughts. Well, actually, to hide the fact that we don't have any thoughts, right? And what these language models are quite interesting is if that is what we sometimes use language for, is just coming up with something to say to conceal the fact that we're not really thinking. Then language models are doing that in a very pure form, right? They're just guessing what the next reasonable thing to say would be, what the next reasonable word to say would be, right? And so it is kind of distressing. It does raise these deeper philosophical issues.
So if I can just come in, because it was really interesting to me. So when I did my PhD many years ago, there was a whole debate. So my background is information seeking behavior. And at the time, knowledge management was becoming really big. And at the time, there was this whole debate about, could you actually capture knowledge? Are you capturing knowledge or can you only capture information? And without getting into it broadly, there was a real big kind of schism where people said, no, all you can actually capture from people is information. You can't capture knowledge because knowledge is something integrated into the psyche. And that can be expressed in tacit and explicit ways. And there was an author, Polanyi, who wrote extensively on this. And so some of the debates that we're having about AI, and I thought that's why both of your points were so interesting. We're kind of having those debates again, because if you look at the media, and to an extent within the academy, has got fixated on this idea, does AI think, right? But to an extent, it doesn't. To a practical instructor level, I'm not sure that matters, because what it creates as a kind of, I mentioned in the video about being a parrot, if it's indistinguishable to the end user, then it, to an extent, it doesn't really matter. And I think a bigger question for us, and I'm really interested, if I can just throw this out, I'm interested what people think. We already know if you ask a AI to generate an essay and say, but give me references, it will generate superficially looking sensible references, which are fake, right? They're not real.
Yeah.
And that's another aspect of it I think we're going to have to be very careful about, which is students and academics to an extent will generate content and they think, oh yeah, this is really good. But they then leave that thinking, well, there's this really great paper by Knight on AI that I've quoted here. This must exist. And they go away and say to someone else, well, actually, Knight wrote about this in 2022, but he didn't. The AI just generated something. And what I think is I'm nervous about, we don't know what's in our heads, but what I'm really nervous about is that our capacity to kind of distort our understanding of reality. Is that a bit deep, maybe? But you know.
And what's the difference between a totally hallucinated reference and just a kind of mistaken one, like one that gets a date wrong or even just a page number? Like because we don't reference perfectly, right? So sometimes we can't find the reference even though it was a sincere attempt to refer to something that actually exists. Anna is back. Welcome back, Anna.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's all right. It's your turn to ask questions, so we will just let you jump right in.
Well, I have a question, I think, for Thomas and Charles, in part because you're not in the US context. But I'm wondering, we're putting so much in a way on students in thinking about surveillance and in-person writing and oral exams. We're sort of trying to restrict students and monitor and modify what they're doing. And I'm wondering if there are some opportunities to think about this more in terms of how does society want to regulate the technology as it affects society? And so is there a role for government? And is there more that the companies could be doing to provide the tools that will make this, not hurt student learning, but facilitate student learning? And so this question, we've mentioned a little bit of the eraser idea really made me think about, oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting off on too many things. So I'll let you take that rather than getting into the eraser topic. But do you see potential for us to turn this toward the companies themselves in some way to improve how this rolls out?
Charles, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. So with my disclaimer again, I'm speaking in a personal capacity. So in my role, I do as a global organization, I interact with universities around the globe and senior leaders. And actually, there's more conversation on this than you would think. And if you look around the globe, depending on where you are, methodologies or pedagogical methodologies of assessment around things like in-person exams, where they're seen as what I'll call the gold standard, varies a lot from different contexts. So there are lots of conversations, interesting conversations around in nation states where they are trying to be technological leaders. We really want to encourage our universities and our students to be involved in big data and AI and so on and so on. And then there's the other tension about, but how does that impact the education system, right? So, for example, should we be introducing grade school children to AI, and should they be using it? And I saw a debate on Twitter the other day where some teachers, school teachers, were complaining that students, small children between kind of 6 and 10, using iPads, was that robbing them of vital skills, which goes back to this moral panic. So I do think there is a regulatory role. And if we look actually in the European Union, there is actually a lot of work at the moment about defining AI standards and ethics, because I think there is an ethical dimension to this. Because if you think about it, the core purpose of the university, one of its core purposes is to illuminate, right, and create new knowledge. And I think there is a role for regulatory frameworks interacting with universities to say, what do we need to do to make sure that our citizens and society are able to still create fundamental truths? Because if we think about social media and all the panics we've seen about social media, right, and the dissemination of effectively made up information, if we don't see that regulation, if we don't see that kind of cooperation between companies and society, could you imagine, say, Twitter in 5 years? It would be absolutely flooded with really convincing sounding bots who you'll probably interact with, think that's a nice person, or that's not a nice person. So there is a regulatory, definitely a regulatory role for government. But in my experience, working with quality bodies and senior leaders in various nation states, they are thinking about this. And I think in the same way I said, we're limited in time about how to inform that pedagogical conversation, I think they're limited in time to think about how do they come up with regulatory frameworks and work with technology companies, right, in a way that is quick enough. Because to go back, Marc made this point, we're slower than technology companies, right? And technology companies always outraces regulators. So regulators are always catching up. And we've seen it with cryptocurrency, which is a different topic, but we've seen it in that crypto space. And so, yes, there is, but we're always going to be catching up, I think. I think we'll see things happen and regulators will say, but how do we deal with that? And just to make a final point on it, because it will become pervasive across society in the sense of the other aspect we'll start to see is students submitting job applications for their first jobs that they haven't constructed, right? They'll submit that and accompany AI that will then assess it. We could really end up in a situation where it's AI assessing AI, so we do need we do need these regulatory frameworks, but the ethical frameworks as well.
Excellent. I totally agree with all of that. Well, I certainly agree with the issues there. This question reminds me of many years ago, we had some advisory boards at CBS for the study programs that we do. And they said something a little bit disturbing, but it was good for me because it was good for my job in a sense, that they said, it used to be that if we hired somebody with a degree from CBS who had gotten good grades, we could be sure that they could write. And so we have these industry representatives coming back to CBS saying, look, something has changed because now we of course are still only going to hire the people with the best grades, but we now also have to test them to see if they can write or give them some sort of remedial writing course before we can have them writing our reports and communicating by email and all this sort of stuff. We're surprised that they can no longer. Right. This is I mean, obviously I'm exaggerating a little bit, but this was the concern that was arising. And so the things that Charles is saying is completely correct, that if they also even start writing their job applications and so forth artificially, then it's not going to indicate to the people who are hiring them that they actually have these skills. And the way I've been putting it is they don't seem to be. They won't actually be as articulate as they can appear on paper, right? So they can get through the paper screening part of the process, seeming quite articulate, and then they will disappoint the person hiring them, or perhaps filtering them out at some other stage. When I was talking to the students about this in class, I pointed out to them that because they were saying, this is, I mean, won't this just be normalized in some way, or what is going to happen? And I am actually a little bit concerned because we're not even embarrassed enough about the things. Like I asked them, is it the case in social life and in professional life that you're very embarrassed if it's discovered that all you know about a subject is something you read on Wikipedia, or that your contribution to this conversation was to immediately Google it? And I mean, what does, I think a lot of people are having this experience now, is you go to the doctor and the doctor pretty unabashedly, quite openly Googles your symptoms to find out what to do about this, right? And this hasn't well, maybe it has undermined a little bit of authority, but it's not something that we've sort of just decided that we have to be embarrassed about. It's just something that we've normalized completely. And so I wonder if I mean, this pushback, this sort of regular, I guess, what could become regulatory pushback, it has to start with some, I want to say, degree of shame about relying on things that we should be able to do ourselves. And so, just one final point on that. I remember when the cell phone was invented, and I was shocked at how quickly it ruined our sense of just the manners we used to have when we said, "Excuse me, I'm going to go get the phone." And then we just started picking up the phone and talking in the middle of a conversation, right? Like it went very, very fast. I thought we were going to be adults about this much longer than we were. And I think the same thing is happening with many of these technologies, that we just we're not being old school moralists enough. We're not being, about these things initially because it's tech, I think. Because it's tech, right? With that, I think I will hand it off to Marc for questions. I think I'm getting this order right? Yeah, Marc. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that too. I think this is a really good discussion to start with. I think that the one pause I have with this and the question I have for you guys as a group is, we're assuming that to some degree this technology is going to be recognizable in the next 3 to 4 years, right? What gives me pause to that, and I think what would make regulation really difficult to it, is that there are some pretty recent examples of major leaps or just things we didn't even think about. The example I'll talk about is the recent one from Meta with their Cicero program. They didn't have just a single language model, there'll be this here too, but they also combined it with a strategic AI to play diplomacy. So multiple different types of artificial intelligence, multiple different types of machine learning working together to actually achieve a task. In this case, beating diplomacy. I don't know if you guys played diplomacy, but it's a shocking game. You have to cheat, you have to backstab people, you have to use empathy, deception to actually do this. And it's mind-blowing that they were able to do that. And we're kind of talking about language models and how that will affect writing. I don't really know if we're thinking about how a chatbot that might use multiple different types of artificial intelligence that would be deployed in our students, how that would impact them too. Some of the things that I've been looking online that have been shocking to me to even think about is that these might be used in assessment of student writing as well too. This might be used as a way to help students as like a chatbot or as a intelligent writing assistant. So I don't know. I don't know how regulators are going to respond to this. I don't know how I'm able to respond to this one day or the next, because it keeps on changing overall. So I wonder if you guys can kind of talk about that, to think about where this is kind of leading to, and our ability to sort of meaningfully respond to this. It seemed to be almost like in real time, and what that's actually going to mean to our students and to our teaching.
Does anybody have I think we should just pipe in there if
I've got a quick thought on this. So the first one is about the speed at which it improves. So not language models, but there's an art AI called Midjourney, and Midjourney had an improvement last month, and the quality improvement of the imagery between last month and this is astonishing. So people are using it to generate alternative versions of Star Wars and Dune and stuff. And I looked at some of those and that absolutely blew my mind. And the other thing is, we're talking a lot here about writing and composition, but for anyone watching this from another area, people are using it to generate architectural plans, right? I saw someone, because there's a Discord channel, you can see people make requests. I watched someone generate their wedding invitations, and they refined them to get the wedding invitation they want, downloaded it, right? So there's all of that going on. And then the other thing tied to what you said about this speed improvement, how we use it, that I meant to mention before, is I've also had conversations with some academics one of the things that you can do with GDP3, there's an API, so you can link it up to other things. And what they told me, and this goes back to your point, Thomas, about shame, is they've started to use it to mark their students' work, right? So what it does is they get it to scan the student work and generate the feedback. And I was saying, so how long does this all take? So, well, it took me a little while to set up the model. But now when the student work comes in, it just generates feedback straight away. And I skim through it to make sure it's okay, but it's okay. And it blew my mind, because I thought one of the ramifications, we talked about job applications, we literally are potentially in a space where students are submitting AI generated content and an academic, without telling anyone, is using a tool to do the marking, right? So there's no human intervention really. So I think what you're really talking about is there are emergent properties when things start to get linked together that we don't really know. And if you think about university, if we go a bit more broad in, there's all these university functions. So you can totally see how it will get tied into keeping a track of student attendance, engagement, student fees, all of these kind of things, right? In a supportive way. So you could just see how we're talking about in a pedagogical sense. Who knows how this will be integrated within 5 years? Because if you think about it, 5 years sounds like very close. But if we look at the speed that these models are improving, and GPT-4, from all the rumors, is going to be so dramatically improved from 3, who knows where we'll be even in 3 months, let alone next year. And it really goes back to that thing about speed, doesn't it? So I think we're all, by the time we put this video out, we could be completely out of date.
Can I jump in?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to respond to that and connect it also to this idea of shame that Thomas brought up, and the idea of these norms shifting, because I think that it is evolving so quickly, and I think we're going to lose the battle on shame. I think it's never going to have the stigma that plagiarism has, and that we're not going to be able to evolve a set of social norms around this against the current of what's already happening. But I do think that if we looked at it in terms of information and thinking tools and a potential for transparency, that we use tools like version history and suggesting and commenting, looking back through versions of a document to see who added what when in human collaboration. And if we could have that with writing, then that would actually help us in our thinking process to see what did the model suggest, and what did I come back with, and that would allow us to help us navigate this changing landscape. It would give us a powerful tool to navigate this, as the tools get much better for generation, and sort of push back against this idea that it's all about fooling somebody, which is kind of the basis of the Turing test in a way. Why do we need to be fooling? Can we agree to have some transparency and to use these tools to boost our thinking and our reflection, maintaining some distance from them so that we can see what was the machine and what was me? So, because we know that the machine is biased and the machine is basing this on a data set of human generated text that is then influencing our thinking. And we need to have some separation from that and recognition that is coming from other humans, statistically processed, and that we might have something else to say about that to push back. So just to be able to distinguish where these ideas are coming from and where the shaping of the writing is coming from, if we could have that transparency, that might take us a long ways without trying to resort to shame, which may be a losing battle. And that's my response.
Excellent. I think Mark was asking everybody. Annette, do you have something you want to add on that?
Well, actually, what Anna just said is a kind of a nice transition to the question I want to ask. So if I can kind of do both, then I'll do that. The idea of transparency was actually central to my question. And it's about, can we use tools with this transparency? That's what you were just saying, Anna, and thinking through those things. And earlier you said too, something about potentially watermarking the text. There's been a lot of these kinds of questions. Technically, it's difficult, it's very difficult to enforce, but here's a lot of ideas that people are kind of throwing out about how do we detect text that's been AI generated. So this idea of transparency, I think, one of the most concerning things about this is the idea of deception and fooling, Anna, that I think you had mentioned. So the idea that we might be and Charles, I think this came up in your video too. It's like, can you trick somebody with this text, which is, I think, the passable, and it's central to this Turing test idea, and the idea that we're like kind of fundamentally building on the idea of deception is, I mean, it's just a very interesting way of framing all of this, right? It's very negative kind of framing. But the other side of transparency that I want to bring up is that the idea of how we know how it's working. And so two things here. One is there's a beautiful new book out by Johns Hopkins by Michael Black called Transparent Designs. And in it, he traces, in particular, the kind of movement in the 1980s, 90s of Apple and different computer companies arguing for transparency. So like, it's like it just works. You just press one button and it just works. And so this whole idea that like interfaces are just transparent, you just use them and they work. And so, of course, behind this idea of transparency is, of course, deception, because it pretends that something just works, but you actually don't know anything about how a computer works if you press a button on an iPad. And this is the same kind of moral panic about, teachers and like, oh, our students are just using iPads, so they don't know anything actually. And I see that actually with my own children using iPads. It's concerning to me personally. But this is part of the design. And that's a kind of deception, right? Transparency as deception. And Black really makes a beautiful argument here, thinking about the history of computing. And so, Charles, when you, in your the beginning of your and I understand, this was for a different audience too, but the beginning you talk about LLMs and how they work, and then you're like, but actually you don't really need to understand this. If you don't understand this, it's totally fine. And part of me is like, yeah, okay, that makes sense for people who are like, I don't know, I have no idea what this is, right? On the other hand, like maybe we do all need to understand this, right? And I think that the Marc, when you're saying that at University of Mississippi, you're talking about AI literacy, I think that's a crucial point about, how much do our students actually need to understand how these technologies work? Is there a literacy problem here, a literacy drive here that we need to be considering? And I'm thinking back to early computational literacy too, and programming literacy, which is like kind of central to the book that I wrote and other research that I've done, and thinking about like Early Basic, for instance, by Thomas Kurtz and John Kemeny at Dartmouth in the 1960s was all about this idea that as citizens, basically computers are everywhere. And in order to produce good citizens, we needed to have them understand certain things about computing. And of course, computing in the 1960s was about programming. And so it's important that we need to have Dartmouth men, it was all men at the time, understand things about computer programming so that, when they go out and be leaders in the world, they have a kind of basic level literacy, and they actually use the word literacy in order to understand computation as central to society. And so, Marc, when you're talking about AI literacy, that really resonates with me. And this is a kind of a long lead up, but I want to put that all back to you in your different educational contexts too, because I think one of the great things about this conversation to me is that we're all coming from very different educational contexts. And so what are the, like how transparent do these technologies need to be for students? That's the short version of this question. What kind of literacy do they need to have, do we think, for them to operate in the world, given that these technologies are actually present and impacting writing already?
Charles, do you want to start with that?
So I'm going to show my age because I think this is a brilliant question, right? So you're right. I totally avoid it in my thing because I'd have had to double the length. So I was like, oh, don't worry about this. So if we think about it, if you talked about computing in the 1960s, there's a really interesting PhD by someone called Sandra Moles who wrote it about 10 years ago, which was about Belgian monks in the 1950s were heavily into astronomy, right? And when big mainframes arrived, they started to use them to do their calculations, and they effectively became computer scientists because they needed to understand how to use them, these Belgian monks. And if we think about personal computing, when personal computing first arrives in the home, I'm of the generation we all learned to a little bit of very basic programming with BASIC, go to 10 and the text would scroll down the screen. And what's really interesting is I'm of a Gen X generation, and we sort of had to know a bit about how this all worked to make it work, right? It wasn't easy. But if you look at the development of web-based technologies and digital technologies and things like mobile phones, the core principle is this idea of things being frictionless, which is what you were talking about, which is we want it to be as easy as possible, and we don't need people or want people even to understand what's going on in the background. And that's partly to do with how people's data is being used. We don't want them to really understand this. And I think you hit on a really powerful thing, which is if we are going to manage this technology in society and the ethical issues, we really need people to understand what is happening, because there is this danger that we talked about earlier that people accept as fact, if I can use little terms, fact, what is generated with no critical consideration, right? And because it looks plausible, it becomes plausible. But if we build that kind of criticality and that understanding of what's going on and all the kind of issues we know around racial and gender bias that's often built into these tools, then we equip our citizens to be able to work in a society where this stuff is going to be prevalent, right? If we don't, that could be quite terrifying, couldn't it? You have citizens who are interacting in a society with tools that are making decisions about them, but they don't really understand why. And to an extent, we see this already with tools like Uber. Uber as a platform is the boss, and you are cut off not by a HR department if you're a driver. You're cut off by an algorithm that decides you no longer meet the algorithm, so you can't drive anymore, right? With no human intervention. But I think your core point is, what is the underlying education that we need to do as a society and with students to make sure they understand what's actually happening? Otherwise, it is this black box. And do we just accept what comes out of the box? You kind of blown my mind, actually. I need to think about this. It's a great question.
I think that I think I've lost a little bit. If Annette, if you could just repeat the question, actually, because I think I'm thinking about so many things now that I don't think are actually an answer to the question. I'm thinking about lots of other things. What was it that you wanted our feedback on?
I think Charles also kind of rephrased it in a helpful way here, but what's the basic kind of understanding that we need students or people in the world to know about how these tools are functioning in our system?
Mark or Anna, do you have?
I'd be happy to respond. I think it's a great question. I think to me, that is the panic, if that's the right word to describe it, right? And it's not just to our students, too. At some level, this is going to have to shift into faculty and staff as well. I'll give you some examples. The other thing from Meta was Galactica, which was designed for education. And they had it open as the demo for, I think, 36 hours before they pulled it down, because educators are saying, wait, I'm able to produce a research paper about the benefits of eating ground glass. Maybe that shouldn't be something I should be able to do. Well, what is the moral and ethical consideration of using a large language model for research, for writing, for publication? Especially since there is no way of actually, seeing if this is actually being used by this. We don't have that. We haven't had that conversation with faculty yet. What do we do when we have a well-meaning graduate student who graduates and goes into Teach for America to underperforming school district and says, man, I could really help my students if I just gave them access to this language model without understanding necessarily the ethical or moral considerations of what would happen there. We haven't had any of those discussions yet, right? Because this is just hitting us right now too. So I think we are approaching this as literacy almost from the ground up, almost foundationally, with our students, but also with teaching our faculty and getting them to kind of think about some of these different sort of questions that can pop up. We obviously think that our students and also our colleagues operate in common trust. It's not about them cheating or anything else. It's just about them using this technology from these really big name companies, Microsoft, Google, Meta, that have a lot of trust built into them, and thinking, what's wrong with that? It's available here too. It's free to use or cheap to use. What could possibly be bad about that? We really do rely so much on this sort of communal trust in these products that are out here that we haven't really had a conversation about what happens if they start or are deployed with these innate biases and can actually produce disinformation and just downright falsehoods. So I think literacy to me is, oh man, it is a wide-ranging discussion, and it's going to be one that will have to be sustained. It can't just be a single workshop or something else. We're going to have to really talk to virtually everyone at the college level, from students to faculty and staff.
I would say amen to all of that. And I would say it is comforting that we have a framework. There is a sense of what it means to teach digital literacy and information literacy. And there are some frameworks for that, and that we can build on to build in critical AI literacy. And I have some hope that this can sort of move quickly and be facilitated by the open educational resources framework, because we can sort of publish and modify materials very quickly through that framework and share them and collaborate on them and discuss them. And so I'm working on a handbook in the next few months that would be sort of a handbook to AI writing assistance tools. And I would just love to invite collaboration on that. To the extent that we can sort of get materials out there quickly for teachers and students to engage with and then go about improving, I think that we can actually begin to just do this, which is what we need to do given how fast the technology is moving.
Excellent. I was just reminded of the you've probably all seen it on Twitter, the little blow up between Jan LeCun and Gary Marcus about Galactica and about all that sort of misinformation stuff. One of the things that Jan LeCun said very early on was, yeah, but when it's perfected, I think he said something like, when it's perfected, can't you imagine it producing scientific content? And I reacted to that by saying there's a really deep issue here with the very idea of producing scientific content, as though text production is actually a contribution of the content of science to discourse. Like that's what science was supposed to do, was produce text. And if I remember noticing this back in the 90s when I was doing science and technology studies, when I was just getting into that I thought it was odd the way they were talking about, the sociologists were talking about knowledge production and text production as though it's a kind of process that makes this thing and then you have it, right? And one of the things that I really emphasize when I talk to students and researchers is that if you're truly writing academically, your goal isn't to contribute content. Your goal is to open your thinking to criticism from peers, right? That's why you're writing. You're putting your ideas out there for peer review, so in case they're wrong, they can be corrected. But if we turn it around and say, well, what science is supposed to be doing is producing articles, so it's supposed to be producing content for culture, I guess, then there's a feedback mechanism there that was supposed to be what scientific writing was all about that completely gets lost. So I emphasize this with students as well, that the reason you're writing is literally to let yourself be examined, to let your ideas be examined. You're not writing just to contribute. I had a student many years ago, way before this, that came to a writing workshop, and I'd said, bring a paragraph, bring a paragraph, and then we can workshop it together. And this person brought a paragraph they'd found online on a page called Sample Paragraphs. And I thought, I have to explain to you now that we can't teach you how to write based on somebody, some other like writing you haven't done. We have to look at your writing, right? So I think these are, I think these are just really very, very important issues to take up on this idea, not just of AI literacy, but literacy in general. I think we just have to remember, I've been saying this a little bit on Twitter as well, that literacy is, it turns out, and we know this now, literacy is impressive when human bodies do it. Like when human beings are literate, that's an impressive achievement. But it turns out just producing text that's grammatically correct, and even consuming it, I suppose, I mean, if you call what they're doing reading, isn't impressive. It depends on how you, because just like getting from A to B within a certain time, like, so, traveling 100 meters in 12 seconds is impressive if you're a human being, right? But it's not impressive if you're a car, or if, so I think that's quite important to keep in mind, that we have to teach students that, what maybe not what they should be ashamed of, but what they should be proud of, like what they could legitimately be proud of in their mastery of language. I think that's an important thing to take. Okay, now we're kind of losing track of time. I guess that's a good sign. Charles, you have not been given a chance to ask questions, so I'm going to make sure you get that now.
I guess we talked about a wide range of topics, and we talked quite a lot about the kind of impact about how we, from a pedagogical practice, talk to students and how we interact with students. I guess the other side of it potentially to talk about is, how do we influence colleagues, our peers, other instructors, academics, about the potential? So if we think about this in a positive sense, the potential for them to integrate into teaching, because the video I did is framed in a particular way for a particular audience, but actually there's a lot of potential to do some really interesting and innovative things. And actually there's potential to use AI across in other areas, i.e. students might generate some content, they might also generate some artwork, right? There are AI maths tools out there. There's some really interesting work coming out of Stanford about AI that will not only answer college level maths problems, but it will then suggest prompts as if it was a student, right? Which are indistinguishable from the real thing. So I guess, how do we have the conversation with colleagues so that they start to think? Because otherwise you do get into that thing that I did in the video, say, don't worry about how it works. But how do we have that conversation? And I'm kind of open that up to the floor.
Maybe I'll just say a quick thing. Very generally, what I tell students is that you should, when you're writing a paragraph, you should make it in such a way that if you show it to another student and you get them to read it out loud and give you a bit of feedback on it for a few minutes, like let's say 6 minutes or something, then you are making that student more interesting to you, that fellow student more interesting to you for those 6 minutes. And if they don't become more interesting after reading your paragraph, then that's on you as a writer. As a writer, your job was to make another person more interesting to you, right? In that time. And I think that's the thing we have to try to say to our colleagues, to our university teachers, is whatever we do with this, we can't let it make the students less interesting to us. Like, we really have to say, when you give an assignment and when you read their work, when you teach them, you have to say, during that time when that assignment is, when you're interacting about it, the student becomes more interesting to you, it becomes interesting to you what they end up saying, right? And I think a lot of the very, very traditional essay writing, even essay grading and giving feedback, the very traditional stuff we do, we have to remember it actually used to be interesting. Even giving a C, just recognizing, oh yeah, this is just a middle of the road, perfectly competent paper, it deserves a C. And then being impressed with B's and A's. Not saddened by the C, but just being, like being interested in being sort of having that sort of gradation. That's something that we've gone away from in many ways in higher education. Because now we want to give everybody B's and A's, and we're sort of saddened by mediocrity. But what I think this can actually do for us is it can help us to appreciate the achievement that being just a middle of the road university student, it actually is. You're literate, you're articulate, you kind of know the stuff. Great. So if we can create situations where the students can still impress us with that and be interesting to us, then I think we've got some. I think that's that's certainly what I try to sell when I talk to colleagues. Marc, were you were?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'll go and respond as well, too. I hosted an event with my former chair, who's now the director of academic innovation here, Bob Cummings, at the University of Mississippi. We worked with the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. We co-hosted it about just basically saying, hey, this is happening. We had about 25 people attend. And from that one meeting, we were invited to several different departments on campus. We've talked to psychology, we've talked to business management. I'm going to be talking to pharmacy. So it's just really getting out there into sort of a centralized message and talking to at least one compassionate administrator to say, look, this is going on here. Can we kind of talk to our fellow faculty to just let them know what's going on at this point, right? We're not even really having in-depth conversations yet. We're just basically saying, this is what's arrived. This is what it might be mean for your teaching. You might want to think about this. Would you like to have a conversation? And that's kind of what this has been developed. I've also worked with our academic outreach, which is our online teaching here too. And they've given me a fellowship. And part of that fellowship is running faculty learning communities. And one of those is doing it exclusively with with AI and online sort of settings. And so that's also been beneficial as well too. So I think you just have to kind of get out there. You have to start doing the legwork. It is exhausting, to be honest, at this point. I said this before, I'll say it again, I cannot even really think about how many meetings I've had this semester. I think it's more than the last 10 years that I've been teaching. And it's been rewarding. I love it. I love talking with them, but it's a lot. It's an awful lot.
I am so impressed by all that you've done, and also by how your institution has invested in it. I think you're way ahead of most colleges and universities, and that's a good model. The thing that really strikes me is how both fear and excitement play into this, and how that we don't want those to drive our response. I mean, I think I hear from everybody here that we want to do what's going to be best for students' learning process and for society in the long run, for what a college education means. And naturally, given how this is unfolding and what it's like to work with these tools, there is a lot of fear and a lot of excitement, and also, of course, potential for projection and the Eliza effect and thinking these things are sentient. That's a whole other can of worms. But I think just sort of watching and acknowledging the way that emotions play into this for us who are teaching about it and talking with our colleagues, and also for the colleagues who are going to have strong reactions emotionally, I think, as they learn about the reality. And, I had my chair say, GPT-3, it's like you're speaking another language. And she said, to her, this seemed like something that was so far in the future that she just really couldn't engage with it. And so I think that just looking at that emotional reality and thinking kind of rhetorically about how do we want to approach this given our own feelings and given the way colleagues are going to respond and the range of responses emotionally. And I'm curious what others might say about that.
Annetta, have you got a take on this?
Honestly, I'm just learning a lot from here. I feel like as a writing program administrator, nobody has yet come to me. I mean, out of the thousands of sections of composition that we run, but and I did start a conversation with some other composition administrators about, have you seen any of this? And they don't explicitly see any of it. But of course, it doesn't mean that that's not happening. And I recently gave a guest lecture in the computer science department, and the students, it was like 150 students in a room, and I introduced a AI tool called Paragraph AI that was, the rhetoric of it was specifically targeting students in the ways that and like very like transparently, but like with enough of an excuse that it's like we're not really doing contract cheating or whatever. And I posed it to the students, I'm like, who is this talking to? And they were like, me. Like, like I also impress for time. I also want to, work on my writing in this way. And so there's a kind of, I think that the students themselves are ethically wrestling with this. The conversations that I had with students in that class and then afterwards, a number of them came up to me afterwards. And I think that they also don't know what's okay and what's not. And, students who are genuinely wanting to work on their writing, but also experiencing difficulties with time. I mean, we've all been through a pandemic. They've been through trauma, stress. They're making up for a lot of gaps in education they've had through virtual learning and missed classes and things like that. And so I think they're trying to figure out how technologies can fill in some of those gaps. And I think some of them are maybe looking for guidance on how to work through these things. And I think that, if we operate, Marc, I liked the way that you presented this, that, if you're operating with the assumption of trust, then, the students on a very basic level do trust their writing teachers. And so, how can we help guide them through, AI literacy, through ethical ways of using this? I think that students are interested in that. And the ways that you talk about, other potential interested people on campus too, it's not like, coming in with this kind of top-down regulatory framework or defensive attitude or, whatever. I think, Charles, you were kind of saying that this is like the fear, right? But operating more from, here's a few people that we can maybe work through and think about how to move through policies that are operating from trust, but also like ethical guidance and writing.
One of the things that this makes me think about is this sort of, and I've tried to decide whether or not this is a dystopian image or just the future in some kind of way. That, I mean, education today is in some part teaching students facts, not very much anymore. We're not so concerned about teaching them facts. We're much more concerned about teaching them critical thinking and various kinds of learning skills. But then, of course, that it's also a time when they build networks, various kinds of social networks, and they acquire books. So they acquire and other kinds of data, literature. So maybe they're building up a file of papers that are useful to them. They're learning how to use the equipment. So they're the computer in various ways, building up archives. Some of them are building up code libraries of various things, right? So they've got so it's really assembling a toolbox for their future lives. And will training your personal AI to speak in your voice and write your emails in a plausible way so that you can even ask it to write a letter to your mom about what you did last week, is this something that will just naturally become part of getting an education, just like all the other things that you acquire along the way while you're at university? And and I guess this literacy issue, this AI literacy issue, could be, well, if we did that very, very deliberately, would there still be a kind of craft or art, like an artisanal writing that would still remain and that would still be interesting to teach them? So like writing good prose, good literary prose, maybe even writing poems would be something that students would then need to do, because so much of it can be automated. So many of their things can be automated, and they're just building a machine that can do that for them. It'll be cloud-based, of course, so they don't even have to own the machine. But then they'll want to learn how to use language in that kind of personal way as well. And maybe that's, we're getting into kind of a niche boutique kind of area for it. That's one of the things that concern that I think about that concerns me, because we do have, I mean, we still, even though we can move around very fast in cars, we do still have professional athletes that impress us with how fast they can run, right? I mean, it's no big deal that you can run fast at a certain level, but it is still something that we valorize, and I think writing and thinking can be that as well. So yeah, so that's sort of the things that gets me thinking about that. We've got about, according to the plan, we have about 10 minutes left for the so-called free discussion, but I think this is we already sort of took some liberties along the way, so that's good. Do you have anything you want to ask about, or oh, sorry, let me just say one thing that we didn't talk about that might be a whole separate talk that we maybe if we want to do this again, is it's something that I'm not very good at, or I'm sensitive to it, but I'm not very good at it, is this question of if we went my way and we said we're going to actually examine the students and whether or not they can sit down right basically in front of us under proctored conditions, not necessarily by hand, but disconnected from the internet, and write a paragraph in, let's say, 27 minutes. That I think it was Anna that raised a concern that there will be students for various reasons that would feel very challenged by that, very concerned by being put in that high pressure situation. So that's sort of the demand of performing an intellectual competence live in some way. Could be a very disruptive move for the students, not just for our pedagogists, but that college becomes this place where you really are, put on the spot and you have to perform, because if we don't force you to do that, maybe you're just getting an AI to do it. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, Anna, and then?
Sure, and I think that connects with what Annette has been emphasizing in the idea of trust and coming from a more positive place with our students. And I don't want to see it become more like a surveillance environment for students. And my only working model is sort of how I've come to use Turnitin and to think about plagiarism. I want to come from a place of trust with my students, but I know that many of them struggle with many pressures and also misunderstandings about what plagiarism is. And so I've opened up the tool Turnitin to them, and I teach them how to use it to check for similarity. And we talk about, the gray areas around plagiarism. And the idea is, I'm not here to catch them, but I do recognize that we need some kind of tool for transparency to sort of help them learn how to do this, and to protect them against the pressures that would create competitive advantage for them if they plagiarize. So ideally, I'd like to have a bit of sense of protecting them from the pressure to use an AI text generator if their classmates are, and that transparency could help with that. But I love that Annette has been kind of pushing us to think about, are we coming from this place of assuming students will cheat and wanting to catch them, and and kind of the way she put out the empathy around students are struggling with this ethically. They want to learn, many of them want to use this ethically, and they may want to do what Thomas is describing, to be able to write something on their own. They may want to be able to do that. So I'm losing the thread a bit, but I just wanted to come around to that idea that we can work with students from a positive place, to confront this with them in an open way.
I wonder if I could add something to that about the questions of working with corporate technologies. So one of the real serious critiques of Turnitin is that they use student intellectual property in order to enrich their database and then sell it back to educational institutions. And then, of course, things we know about Google Docs is that you put in your text in Google Docs and then it's used to train AI, including your own AI. And then I think, I forget, maybe it was Charles mentioning that these things are going to be built into Microsoft moving forward, right? And so all of the teaching that we're doing is actually, as we speak, being co-opted into corporate software, which is then sold back to us, sold back to our students at exorbitant prices. And I mean, I think it's really important for us to think about our institutions and working with our institutions, but thinking about the relationship that we have with corporate software, with open software, with ostensibly free software like Google Docs, which is not open software, and what all of these things mean. I think, part of that also has to do with, whether it's AI literacy, computational literacy, some kind of literacy for both students and faculty about how these technologies work and how data is mined, I think is really important. But it's a real salient question to me, at least, ethically, as a writing program administrator.
Excellent. Thank you. We've got now 4 minutes left. Those, Anna and Annette, if you agree, those were kind of nice closing remarks as well. They kind of can do double duty. Is that so? I'm going to give some. I think if Marc says a few things, and then maybe I'll say a couple of things, and then we'll let Charles have the final word, and then I'll say thanks for your time today. Marc, just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I won't even take that long. I thank everyone for being here. I think that this is the path forward. We've talked about excitement. We've talked about terror. I think the thing that is most troubling to me is indifference, right? It's easy to ignore something you can't actually show as having an impact and sort of there too. And now common sense would dictate that this is cheap. This is being put out there by these massive organizations. It's going to have some sort of impact. But it is a moral choice to pay attention. It's an ethical choice to pay attention, right? And be aware of what's going on too, and be there too. That's kind of how I'm going to leave this. And just to kind of focus on that is that we are making a good, positive choice to just literally acknowledge what's going on as reality. And I'll go ahead and put this back to you guys.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's also, I think I'm just going to agree with that. I think the fact that we're talking about it and taking it seriously, explicitly, I think that's what we just have to keep doing, and then we'll have to see what happens. I think if we do it with eyes open, I think it's better than just backing into it. So that would be my advice to us as well. And I'll say thank you in a second after Charles says the last intelligent things tonight.
Well, mine's actually really straightforward and simple, which is thank you, which is so I feel like I boxed myself in a corner because we talked about AI, and I sometimes feel, because I'm very active on Twitter, in that context I come across as quite grumpy and like AI is going to destroy us all, but that's not it at all. And what we've done here for me this evening is kind of where humanity shines through, right? The conversations and the context and the things we've discussed. Isn't this what the Academy is for, right? So for me, it's just a thank you, really, because I've kind of wanted, there's not actually, surprisingly, many venues to have these conversations. And they are, you just mentioned it, everyone's mentioned it, we need to have these conversations, right? These are serious, in-depth issues. So actually, it's not really a comment, it's a thank you. It's blown up all sorts of other ideas, really, I need to think about, and also how I position myself in these videos.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think I think we should acknowledge how impressive this meeting really has been. I mean, we don't know each other. I think any of us know each other from anything other than Twitter. So somehow Twitter didn't make us hate each other from the start. We were able to very, very quickly, with just a few gestures, establish some rules of engagement and some topics to discuss. And I think we did brilliantly. Of course, now we can watch the video and see how brilliantly we actually did, if it's like reading your own writing or something. But I just want to thank you for trusting the idea and for trusting each other. I think we did. I'm just really, this is heartwarming that we could do it. Thank you very much. I will. Let me just stop the recording.